Hello, everyone. You're in the right place. Come on in, find a seat. We'll get started at the top of the hour, which is less than a minute away. All right. According to my watch, it is in fact the top of the hour. So hello and welcome. My name's Alan Barr. I'm with COEH Northern California, and on behalf of the NIOSH-supported education and research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to bring you another installment of the 2025 ERC Ergonomics webinar series, where we offer free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. If you logged in with your registration email, you'll get a link to an evaluation form, and that'll qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 CE contact hour. Coming up on the 4th, there's another talk you might want to join us for. It's Collaborative Care in Motion, the Power of Nursing and Ergonomics in Workplace Health. For today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, and I certainly encourage you to do so, please enter it into the Q&A, and we'll save some time at the end of the presentation to address those questions. The webinar is being recorded today, and it'll be made available along with all of our past webinars on the COEH Northern California YouTube channel. In support of our work, please take a moment to like and subscribe to that channel as we continue to grow it. A PDF of the presentation can be requested directly from COEHCE at berkeley.edu. That's COEHCE at berkeley.edu. Today's topic, neuroergonomics in the aging population, integrating mind and body for workplace safety. Our speaker today is MK Wintz. MK is a doctoral candidate from the University of Cincinnati exploring the integration of mind and body into human performance, with a special interest in how improving cognitive function through integrated practices can improve career outcomes and longevity across populations. With a background spanning sports and human performance, manufacturing, and research, she brings an interdisciplinary lens to the workplace safety. Her current research focuses on improving activities of daily living for aging adults through cognitive motor training. And with that, I'll hand the mic over to MK. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, again, my name is MK Wintz. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Cincinnati. I'm in my last year there, and I'll be sharing with you guys today some of the work on that's going toward my dissertation. Like we said, this is neuroergonomics in the aging population. We're looking at integrating mind and body for workplace safety. So just a brief agenda of topics for the day. We're going to be going through a quick overview of what neuroergonomics are. We're going to go through some of the workplace injury risk and how brain and body contribute to those risk factors. The current state of the aging workforce, and then start getting into some dual task benefits and ways that we can approach neuroergonomics, training neuroergonomics, and uptraining employees for safety and health and well-being. Lastly, we'll go through a quick minute on how we can maybe apply some of these things in your workplace, and I'll try and leave some time for questions as well. Just to review for all of us today, the learning objectives, I know that this is a continuing education course, so I want to make sure that everyone's getting what they want out of it. We're going to be looking at how the brain and body function contributes to workplace injury risk. We're going to talk about how aging impacts both physical and cognitive function and the human performance. We're going to go ahead and look at some evidence that looks at dual task training, how this can improve both cognitive, motor, and dual task outcomes, and then consider ways that we can apply neuroergonomic strategies to support our aging workforce. So with that, neuroergonomics is actually the study of the mind and body at work. So I know that this is an ergonomics focused seminar, which generally is going to just be looking at the body and the performance of humans in the workplace. But we actually look at that through a cognitive lens as well. So, how is your mind controlling your body? How does your mind impact your movement and your ability to stay safe as you're getting your job done? When we think about neuroergonomics, there's a few different ways that we can start to look at neural function or cognitive function. With cognitive function, you can always look at some paper tests, these sorts of things. But when we start looking at neuroimaging, that's when we can start to get some real time feedback on what's happening in life. Um, so, kind of the span of neuroergonomics, you can look at static imaging, which is going to be basically a fixed human looking at the brain in generally at rest, but sometimes doing tasks that are really easily executable within an MRI tube, for example. And that spans all the way up to what we would consider ultramobile imaging. So these are EEGs, FNIRS, different imaging techniques that you can get out in the world. In this case, you can even see somebody's got an EEG while they're out riding a bike in the workplace. Um, so that study was actually looking at for delivery cyclists, how they could better mount and dismount their bikes based on their surroundings. So distractions, auditory distractions while riding bikes. So, some really interesting techniques from very static to very mobile that we have access to here. I went ahead and put another little slide here, just talking about all the different ways that we can start to look at the brain. Again, when we're thinking about these different ways that we can actually get at neuroimaging, there's basically three axes that we can consider. We've got temporal resolution, or how fast can we capture the imaging of the brain. So, are we looking at really rapid electrophysiological signaling through EEG, or are we looking at slightly slower capture rate with fMRI that has really good spatial resolution? So we can tell you exactly where in the brain the activity is occurring, but not necessarily how quickly it's happening. So with that, I want to get into some of the ways that we can start to look at workplace injury risk, and how our brains and bodies can combine to change our risk factors. Um, so looking back at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, um, there's a few different ways that people tend to get injured and have days off of work due to illness or injury. So BLS stats from 2020, assessed in 2021 and 22, released in 2023. During that time period, the number one injury or illness risk was due to exposure to harmful substances or environments. Given that COVID was happening at that time, that was kind of a known leap in terms of workplace risk. But the next two are actually overexertion and slips, trips, and falls. So those make up 43% of injuries that led to lost time away from work. So there's very clearly a need to look at how we can reduce lost time due to these injuries and help keep employees safe. Um, and I put on the right here just kind of a little image, because one of the ways that we can look at physical ergonomics, which is what we would typically focus on, is something like the lifting index. So overexertion can happen when you have to lift more than you're actually capable of lifting. But the occupational safety and health recommendation for the lifting index comes from the actual load itself being lifted. Um, so it doesn't really take into account the individual's capacity to lift weight. So, just to give a quick example, when I first started training for my sport, um, I was able to lift about 1.3 times my body weight. So if I had to lift 1 times my body weight for 4 repetitions, that's going to be a lot more strenuous on me than later in my training career when I could lift 2 times my body weight, and that relative ratio is much less. So when we're looking at this lifting index, it doesn't necessarily take into account the individual performance factors. When we start looking at neuroergonomics, that's the kind of stuff that we really want to start getting into, is what is your relative loading and how are these risk factors impacting you as an individual. So like I said, I was just talking about the physical capacity. And when we look at the contributions to workplace injury risk from the physical side that are not workplace parameters. So this is personal, individualized risk factors that don't have to do with your workplace or your job itself. When we look at univariate models for material handlers, so people that are lifting heavy things frequently, a lot of the risk factors come into play due to aerobic power, ability to run, and some risk-taking ability or risk-taking inclinations. So things like a willingness to speed or a willingness to or watch fighting. When we look at multivariate factors, it becomes much more focused on your physical capacity. So things like your BMI, your percent body fat, aerobic power, flexibility, and whether you're a smoker or not. So we know that our bodies contribute to workplace injury risk, but we also know that our brains can contribute to workplace injury risk. So I put a couple of graphs up here. Again, I came from an athletic background, and some of that work was in neurovisual training. So up training our reaction times, our ability to respond appropriately to dynamic situations. Um, when we consider this, what we can see is that actually, when you have faster reaction times, you're less likely to get injured. So we were looking at college cohort of athletes, the sprain and strain incidents across the athlete population based on whether they were starters or non-starters and how their reaction times correlated with injury risk. So when athletes had slower reaction times, regardless of whether they were starters or not, they were more likely to experience musculoskeletal injury in their sport. This was a trainable factor where athletes were able to get not only more accurate, but faster with training. So when you train your visual motor reaction, you're able to improve those performances and reduce your risk of musculoskeletal injury. There's been quite a few reviews as well with the translation to occupational health and safety, where improved reaction times and training can also support injury risk reduction in a workplace environment. One of the main ways that we actually have the brain body interaction failure when we're considering workplace injury is because of threat habituation. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with the fact that if you are routinely exposed to a hazard, the threat of that hazard tends to seem like less and less with time. Um, Given that, there's ways that we can actually restore attentional focus with traditional training interventions. So looking at how can we actually refocus on the task, how can we make sure that we're cognizant of the risk factors of our jobs more frequently so that we're engaging with our job in a safe way. Another way that we can improve that is not only from, kind of task specific training or occupational relevant training, we can actually improve it also through mind body interventions. So, mind body interventions like mindfulness can help us restore attentional focus, which can help us with not only having better accuracy, but making better decisions. So, for example, in one of the studies that I was looking at for neural response to a flanker test, which is where you have to ignore um, irrelevant information. So in this case, it's your flanking arrows or your flanker test, and only look at the direction of the arrow in the center. So the bottom images that you can see on the screen there, both of those are actually pointing to the left. Um, but it can get harder to see when your flankers are telling you to look the other way, which we would consider the incongruent case compared to the congruent case where all the arrows point to the left. So when this study did the mindfulness intervention, um, the participants actually increased their decision-making care, which can help improve or reduce the factor of threat habituation, improve intentional focus in the workplace, and help us avoid injury. One of the other ways that these mind-body interventions can be useful is actually in balance regimes. So like we were talking about before, the slips, trips, and falls tend to be a high contributor to workplace injury. So they're the third highest at 20% of annual injuries. Um, not only are there environmental factors to a slip, trip, or fall. Let's say there's a slippery floor because there's a bit of oil or water at the doorway. Um, there's then the initiation of the fall. So somebody maybe took a longer step than usual, or maybe they were wearing a higher heel than usual, or didn't wear their slip-proof shoes for the day. So that person starts a slip. Then they have to actually detect, their body has to then detect the fact that they're slipping and falling, and they're going to try and correct for that. They're going to try and catch themselves. So that's their proprioceptive systems are going to start to kick in. Their vision is going to kick in. They're going to fixate on a specific spot on the floor or a wall to try and stop this disturbance from occurring and taking them down in a fall. The CNS is going to help recover for that, activate your muscle patterns to help recover from this fall. And the hope would be that you then don't fall. But if you have possibly muscular inefficiencies or reductions to your proprioceptive system, your visual system, then you're more likely to fall. The study that we're looking at here actually was inducing falls across various age of employees. They wanted to see how far do older workers fall, and is it different than younger workers? So they set up this rig, bunch of motion capture cameras, uh, hooked their employees up into a safety harness, and basically were inducing slips, trips, and falls. Um, which is kind of a fun study, I thought, um, to see how their employees were actually able to recover. Um, what was really interesting was that depending on how quickly the subjects were able to recover was based on their sensory organization. So their ability to integrate their proprioceptive input, their visual input, so their ability to rapidly retrieve the information from their body for where they are in space corresponded directly with how far they were slipping, and how well they did on motor control tests. And all of this was also related to their age. So older adults in this study were slipping further and had less sensory organization. So they're more likely to fall. So all of that being said, we are definitely seeing some of these impacts within our aging population. The mind-body integration does change as you age. We also know that our workplace is aging. So, given that falls are one of the most common workplace injuries, it was actually 30% of all injuries, not just time lost injuries, and that our oldest population is aging the fastest. So, workers who are 65 and older are outpacing in growth for that cohort, all other age groups. Um, and we know that cognitive function is correlated with workplace accidents. There's a way higher likelihood of slips, trips, and falls continuing to get worse as our workforce ages if we don't continue to take intervention on reducing those slips, trips, and falls. Um, there's also some interesting factors around how older and younger adults get injured in the workplace. Our youngest employees tend to see more frequent injuries, but they're less impaired by those injuries. So usually they tend to be harmed more frequently by contact with equipment or exposure, so they're more likely to take risks. Whereas our older employees are less likely to have risk-taking behaviors, but more likely to slip, trip, or fall, have those factors of balance impact their ability to stay safe in the workplace. One of the things I found really interesting was that older workers were considered anyone from 35 to over 65, 70 years. So we can see that there's a really wide range of what they consider older adults, depending on which study was looking at which intervention. Um, I don't think I'm necessarily going to make a comment on where I think that line should sit, but we do know that we start to see cognitive decline generally around 50 years of age across most populations. Um, so we know that this is going to be important as the workforce does tend to age past that 50 for average age across most industries. So this was a kind of cool study that was looking at different stressors in an aging population. So it was actually comparing men and women, and looking at during those stressors, what was their brain doing? So this was a neural study. They were using fNIRS to study the connectivity of this population. And so what they actually found was that the motor intervention um, was basically a grip strength test. So they were testing how well the participants were able to grip the force plate. Um, and did that vary between men and women in this aging population? While they were doing that physical task, they actually had an fNIRS system on. So we were talking before about these different types of brain measurements that we could get. The fNIRS system is an oxygenation measurement. So it's actually looking at global cortical activation through a metabolic lens. And they're looking at what they considered functional connectivity with time during this task. So pre-task, post-task, or sorry, pre-test, post-test with a stress intervention, they were looking at how connected are the frontal cortex and the motor cortex for integrating their decisions while they're moving. What was really interesting is that men actually saw pretty significant changes due to stress, and the women did not see as many changes either to cortical activation or their physical performance. So men saw improved motor performance despite a reduction in their cognitive connectivity across brain regions. What's really interesting about this is that it actually points to different loading strategies, different neural responses to different stressors in work environments. And so, depending on what type of stress you have, what your reaction to stress is, you could have a unique response in your cognitive motor performance on the job. And so this is starting to study how is that actually impacting each of these individuals, and are there group level risk factors that we can be considerate of or cognizant of as we're looking at reducing workplace, improving workplace safety for different populations. So when we look at when we take a neuroergonomic lens to look at motor performance, we can know that aging leads to loss of muscle strength, increases in hearing and vision loss, and decreased postural stability. Again, all of these are going to increase your risk factors for workplace injury and especially attentional awareness. We also know that younger and older women or workers are going to have different behavioral responses, where younger workers are more likely to make any decision quite quickly. Older workers tend to make a better decision a bit more slowly. So this changes the risk factors and the neuroergonomic approaches that should be taken for these specific populations. So next I want to get into some dual task training and some dual task benefits. So we've talked about the fact that we know that physical performance can impact your workplace safety. We know that your cognitive factors in your cognitive function can actually impact your workplace safety. We know that there's risk factors from having those combined. When you do experience a dual task event, there tends to be a cost associated with that. So, are there ways that we can reduce the cost of dual tasking? And when we start to look at meta-analyses of dual task interventions, we can see that in cognitively impaired, mild cognitive impairment individuals, across multiple studies, we actually see that dual task trainees in clinical populations outperform the controls across a random forest plot of memory tasks. They have better attentional focus, they have better integration, better proprioception. So there's quite a few different cognitive functions that are improved by dual task training. What's interesting about this is that, again, similar to kind of a physical intervention, you might see an acute decrement in your performance due to dual task. We call that, again, the dual task cost. And this means that it can be actually harder to perform the dual task in the acute sense. But over time, if you're exposed to that intervention over and over and over again, you get more efficient and you're able to actually improve your performance on that dual task and reduce the cost. And it gets easier to integrate these different portions of your um, lived experience so that you can start to respond more appropriately, more quickly. Um, the other set of graphs that I have on this page was actually looking at older and younger adults in their accuracy and reaction time. So the top graph is the reaction time, the bottom graph is the accuracy across these different populations. Um, and you can see that both the older and younger adults got faster with their training interventions, despite the older adults still being slightly slower overall. Um, what was really interesting is that the accuracy of the responses for the adults really increased with this dual task training, whereas the younger adults saw just kind of a stagnant result from training. So they didn't necessarily improve their accuracy all that much with training intervention, despite getting a bit faster. So really interesting that we actually see different outcomes from this intervention across different populations. So just circling back to what we were talking about before, with these being the most common occupational injuries, and thinking about the kind of individual loading that we have. When we think about the overexertion and your capacity to lift and slips, trips, and falls, it starts to kind of point to looking at possibly working more within a cognitive motor training intervention. So, can we improve your balance, your postural stability, improve your neural integration of your proprioceptive systems, your vestibular systems, your visual systems, so that you can have a reduced likelihood of slips, trips, and falls, while improving your physical resilience so that you are less likely to overexert yourself in the workplace? And are there any ways that we can start to tailor these approaches to demographic groups or even individuals based on their individualized responses? So, with that in mind, the study that I designed was looking at a dual task training intervention, which was going to be 12 weeks of cognitive and motor training interventions, and that the hypothesis is that this would then improve cognitive function, physical function, and dual task outcomes for our aging population that we were studying. Um, the kind of outcome of this would be then that our dual task trainees would have improved quality of life, reduced risk of injury, improved ability to engage with their activities of daily living. And the most important part was that they would likely require less cognitive effort to execute these tasks. So instead of having, let's say, a cognitive task take 80% of their cognitive capacity, could we accomplish the same task only using maybe 50% of their cognitive capacity? So we got a group together of about 50 adults. These were all over 50 years old, with an average age of about 61. We had slightly more females than males in this particular population. And they did not have any current musculoskeletal injuries. They didn't need any assistive walking devices. They had no significant signs of cardiovascular, metabolic, or pulmonary diseases, and they all had no diagnosed cognitive impairments. So they were all healthy, aging adults, and they were randomized into two different groups for a 12-week intervention period. The intervention period consisted of the same physical exercises for both groups. So they were actually all doing squats. If one group was doing squats and going to touch a cone and then coming back to another cone doing a squat, touching a cone, going back and doing the squat again, the other group might be going up to the board and tapping the same colors, scanning across all these different colored light boards and picking the two squares that have the same color, and then going back and doing their squat, coming back, finding the two yellow squares, and then going back and doing a squat, repeating to the blue squares. So finding the matching colors, hitting them, and then going back. if they were doing a walking task, so that if they were on the treadmill. The physical group would be walking on the treadmill high intensity, whereas the cognitive or dual task group would be doing that same walking task, but they might be doing multiplication, times tables, addition, subtraction, some basic math to cognitively engage as they were moving. And then all of these participants did both a pre and a post assessment to see how their physical, cognitive, and dual task function improved, but also how their brains responded as they were being tested. So we were talking about the flanker test earlier, and that was actually one of the tests that we had our subjects going through. You can see up on the board, the arrows are pointing to or from a different direction across the different light board there. So this is a flanker task. They also did some letter tasks, so some alphabet-based tasks where they were basically skipping every other letter and hitting the A and then the C and then the E on the board. So they had to scan it, find it, and then hit that. You can see kind of a listing of all the results here that we found. So we did some grip strength testing, we did some push-ups, box squats, a physical task, which was basically looking at those box squats again, a cognitive task, which was the letter task only, and a dual task, which was the physical task of box squats, the cognitive task of letter skipping, but they had to do the box squats between each letter that they were going to hit on the light board, the SmartFit board from the slide before. And what was really interesting is that we start to see some group level differences across these different tasks that they were measured on before and after. So one of the key areas that I was most interested in, given all of what we talked about around balance and postural stability, I was really curious how much this training intervention would actually help integrate the proprioceptive experience of each of these adults. And so we had all of them do what's called a 4-square step test. In this test, each of the participants started in 1 square and they had to step both feet into each of 4 squares on a little cross and then return the other direction that they came from. They weren't allowed to hop between the squares. And this is a pretty good measure of balance and postural stability. There may be some folks in the audience who are curious why we didn't use a force plate or center of pressure. We simply didn't have the equipment on site. And so we went with something that was readily available, transferable between the multiple sites of the test intervention, and so that we could apply it across all of our populations, across a few different studies that we were running. So with the 4-square step test, this was a timed outcome measure. So a faster time to complete means that you likely have better integration and superior balance. And we saw that both groups improve performance. So when we look at these little violin plots, the dual task are the two violins on the far left. The physical only group are the two violins on the far right. And what we're looking for here is a shift in that distribution downward so that you can actually see a faster time to complete for the population of interest. And we do definitely see that in both groups got a bit better, but the dual task seems to pull down just a bit more. We've got some descriptive statistics along this as well, and we do see some significant differences along these groups. What's most interesting is we were running the EEG as we did this. And what we see is when we look at the dual task group along the top compared to the physical group along the bottom at the post period, which is on your far right, the dual task group has a lower regionalized connectivity. So when we're looking at kind of local connectivity, so how strong are the connections near a given electrode on the EEG helmet? It's going to be more red if you're seeing higher recruitment. You see that higher recruitment if it's taking you more effort to do that task. So for example, in this 4-square step test, if you're having to really think about where you're at in space, make a decision on which step you need to be taking, you're going to be using a lot of your frontal lobe in order to make decisions on where you're going and how quickly you're going to get there. You're also probably going to be engaging a lot with your occipital lobe. You're going to be looking at where you need to step next so that you can know how to execute this task. we see those regions all kind of lighting up in that physical group where they aren't quite as primed for these specific tests, whereas the dual task group has integrated these experiences across all sorts of different training environments. And so coming back to the novel task of the four-square step test in this training, the post-period assessment wasn't so shocking to their systems, and they were able to actually have that appropriate balance output and see improved performance. So I thought that was pretty interesting in the balance specifically. And then we also looked at the cognitive performance. So I went ahead and skipped the physical performance. Both groups got better. We would really expect that. We saw slightly reduced connectivity for the dual task group. We think it's primarily, again, driven by the fact that they've got slightly more integrated, but not huge differences between the groups in the physical performance. When we look at the cognitive performance, um, we're actually looking at more strikes are better in this case. So we actually want to see this violin kind of suck upward in look or in appearance. So where that distribution is in the higher level. So the cognitive assessment, just as a reminder, is where they were doing the alphabet skip test. So the A, C, E, and they had to scan that on the SmartFit board. What's interesting is that the dual task group saw a 9% improvement on average, with a pretty focused effort simply on seeing and doing, whereas the physical only group, on average, actually saw no change in their performance. Um, when we start to look at the connectivity, I think it's really powerful again here. You can see just how cool the dual task group is at the post period, meaning that they had a really low level of activation, the low level of coordinated recruitment, meaning that this task was actually relatively easy for them. It wasn't super hard for them to be thinking and doing. Whereas the physical only training group really had to see, think, plan which letter am I supposed to be hitting, where am I finding it on the board, and then actually executing the task of hitting the board itself. And they saw effectively no training improvement or no improvement over the training period in the cognitive task. Then we go to look at the dual task, where the same training groups, this is the one where they actually were doing the squats between each of those cognitive strikes. Again, more strikes are better. So we want to see that shift up in the violin, which we see with the dual task group. And actually, the physical group seems to have a slight decrement in their ability to perform the dual task. And they required a slightly higher level of activation overall and even higher than their baseline activation across the whole brain. So when we look at that inverse distance weighted plot, they've got a slightly hotter plot all around. So not only did they have to recruit more of their language areas because it was an alphabet-based task, but they had that more coordinated neural activity to see slightly worse performance at the end. So there is a chance that because they were so primed to do the physical performance when they came into their training environment, that they were really leaning on the physical strategy and didn't have the coping skills for focusing on the cognitive task between each physical repetition. So I think we've got enough time that we can do a really quick activity break. So I know a lot of you guys are online, so this is just going to be a little bit of a self-exploration here. We're not going to be actually taking any measured scores because I don't have access to that, but if you ever want to take a score, there's some online resources that we can get you. But we're going to do a little bit of a dual task activity here. So this is going to constitute of a physical task, which we're going to call a tap task, an NBAC test. So that's basically a memory test, and then a dual task where you're going to be both doing the tap and the NBAC test at the same time. Each of these are going to be about 20 seconds, so it shouldn't be too cognitively loading for any of you, but maybe a fun break in your day here. So as soon as I switch this slide, what I want you to do is tap every time that you see the color square change that's on the left-hand side of your screen. So we're going to go in 3, 2, 1. So we're just going to tap, 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 tap. All right. So it was probably fairly easy to keep up with the tapping there. I know I got a little ahead of myself. Classic, getting too excited. Um, so next up, we're going to be doing what's called an N-back test. So this is going to be actually be a two-back test. So what you're going to see on the screen is those same two red squares. This time we're going to be looking at the right square, and we're going to see a series of letters popping up. So for example, it'll be A, B, C, B. When you see that second B, because you saw a B 2 letters ago, you want to make a mental note, tap your left hand if that helps you out. And we're going to see how many of the N backs you can get correctly. So again, I'm going to count us down and we're going to go in 3, 2, 1. All right. So I hope some of you got a couple of end counts there. So if you guys can just make a little note really quick of how many you think you got. I'll give you the answers at the end here. Um, so for the last test that we're going to do, we're doing the dual task test. So this one's going to be pretty challenging because you're going to have both the blinking square on your left and the end back happening on your right. So I want you to try and tap your fingers along with the tap test and then do the end back test on the other side. So two things happening at one time. Um, so let's see how you do compared to each task individually. And we're going to go in 3, 2, 1. All right. I don't know how that went for you, but I know that I missed 2 on the NBAC test. So there should have been 4 NBACs, 2 N's, 2 J's that you saw. Um, and I know that I missed 2 and I could not keep count on my tap. So I personally really struggled with my dual tasking today. I think I was a bit distracted by some other environmental factors. And I think this is a really simple way to see how quickly something that is a fairly easy task on its own can become really challenging when you combine another fairly easy task. So when we start to think about how that might apply in the workplace, um, there are so many different ways that we can look at minimizing the risks of dual tasking. So obviously, we've talked about quite a few different training strategies in looking at ways that we can do a dual task intervention. So that would be like we were talking about before with the cognitive motor training intervention of actually exposing people to doing both at the same time. But there are a few other ways that we can start to get better attentional focus and cope with dual tasking better in the workplace. So, some of the ways that I would recommend taking this back into your workplace are to look for potential dual task hazards. How many spots are there in your workplace that have mind traps, spots that might increase cognitive load unnecessarily? I know that there's some spots that I have a couple steps that aren't quite 6 inches apart, or whatever the standard's supposed to be. I know that there is one, and I know I miss that step darn near every time. And so I have to actively think about that step in particular because it doesn't fit the schema of the rest of my steps. I'd also ask you to think about where does possibly a physical load require increased motor planning. So is there a task that you have to accomplish or your employees have to accomplish where they're having to twist or move under load? These activities that take high coordination, high recruitment, or teamwork are all places where you have to increase your motor planning, and they might be good opportunities to figure out how you might be able to reduce the hazard of the dual task occurring at the workplace. Um, in addition to looking at all of your ergonomic factors, such as can you add a lift? Can you take the job away? Can you improve the floor surface, for example, against the slip, trip, or fall? Another fairly easy intervention is actually to encourage mind body snacks. So in the same way that people have started to kind of talk about physical snack breaks, where maybe you go do just a couple of jumping jacks or maybe a quick push-up break. If you do even just 2 minutes of mindfulness intervention, there's a bunch that you can choose from, but they can really help support your attentional focus. So things like breath counting, personal emotional check-ins. You can do sensory exposure awareness. So, what colors do I see? Can I touch four feels? Can I notice three smells? These 2 minute breaks or mind body snack breaks, where you start to increase your mind body awareness, can help us cope with dual tasking as well. Outside of that, supporting employee physical and mental well being outside of the workplace can be beneficial. Um, and one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting and growing in the field of neuroergonomics is wearable tech. So, how can we look at possibly training interventions where we can put our employees in a VR environment that matches their work environment and practice those motor skills so that we can improve the task execution without necessarily being under load, or work on attentional focus in a task specific environment. Um, what are the ways that we can monitor these dual task costs real time and train to prevent them? So with that being said, I think that is everything that I have here. Sorry, my computer just reminded me that I've got another meeting coming up. With that, though, I want to say a big thank you to everyone. I really appreciate your time and attention. I hope we've got some really good questions on what I talked about here today. And if we don't get anything during the open question opportunity now, I also provided my email here, so feel free to reach out. Love talking about mind body intervention. So, uh, with that, I think it's question time here.
Thank you so much, MK. That was fantastic. Super interesting, super fun, and a great change of pace for our typical, if you will, ergonomics. Um, Inquiring minds want to know, you did promise us the answer to the number of taps and so forth. Well,
Oh,
thank you.
dual tasking. So yes, there were the taps were at a frequency of 1 hertz. So we hit 20 taps in both of them, and then there were two repetitions of two. So there was an N and a J that showed up in the N back twice per section, and it was actually the same exact. A NBAC test. So you were actually exposed to the same thing twice, which isn't great, and I wouldn't normally do that. But for the purposes of this presentation, I tried to give you guys one little baby leg up there.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Okay, let's jump into some questions here. I think we've got some nice ones. We'll start by, are you familiar with any studies on the 4-day work week and how it might decrease any of these risks? That was from the risks of slip, trips, and falls early on in your presentation. That question came up.
For sure. So I actually haven't done any look into alternative time periods on mind body integration, on slip trips falls. So that's not something that I've looked at in this specific context. So I don't even necessarily want to say anything, but happy to have more discussion on it or look into it. I know I came from swing shifts when I was in chemical manufacturing. And so we had the 3-2-3-4 rotating schedule. And that was really, really tough on a lot of our operations staff, just in terms of getting back on the new schedule. So while I don't have any formal stats on what that might be, I can say experientially likely increased and likely a spot where these mind body integration practices are probably pretty important.
Okay. Ernesto would like to know if he's correct in learning that neuroergonomics is about fitting the worker to the work through physical fitness and mental training. Is that accurate, he asks.
Yeah, I think it's in the same way that we think about that with ergonomics, where it's pairing capacities, right? It's making sure that the work and the employee are capable at the same level. I think that's the same type of environment that we're trying to create here when we think about neuroergonomics. So, if I'm capable of lifting, a super heavy weight, let's say, but my brain just isn't in it. If I'm not thinking about the task, if my all of my focus isn't on engaging my core and doing it correctly, then that task is going to carry a higher risk of injury. And so it's matching the conditions to get people engaged, to keep their attentional focus paired for the appropriate level of task engagement. If I'm going to lift a pen, the level of risk isn't quite the same. And so I don't necessarily need that same attentional focus if I'm grabbing a pen out of my cup, because my risk of injury from grabbing a pen out of a cup is far less than lifting, um, supporting lifting a person in or out of a bed if I'm a nurse.
Okay, you may have already answered this, but the question is, does neuroergonomics have interventions that fit the work to the worker that reduce exposures to hazardous working conditions? Sorry, fumbled that a little bit.
Oh gosh. Again, I don't know that I've specifically touched on that in any of the research that I've done in this particular environment. So I don't necessarily feel super confident in answering that.
Got you.
Happy to get back on that one though.
Okay. Question, would mindfulness breaks also work for office employees and brain tasks?
Absolutely. Mindfulness breaks are really, in my opinion, very important. Um, they aren't a super long intervention. It's really easy to take a second. I mean, there's so many opportunities throughout the day, whether you're maybe needing to go use the restroom or grab a drink of water, have a, while you're eating your meal. Mindful eating is a really easy way to pause for a second and just reconnect with your body yourself. I think it's a great way to reduce the risk of eye strain, which is one of those factors that when we think about workplace safety and ergonomics, I think it's easy to forget about office workers because we do kind of just sit at our desks all day. But a mindful moment to stand up and take a couple deep breaths, look, you're 20 feet away, and reconnect to your mind, your body, your core, your shoulders, your back, your hips, and make sure that things are aligned and that you're reading, writing, and executing well at your desk. I think that's super important as well.
Thank you. Are there any mind and body interventions dealing with complacency issues in safety and neuroergonomics?
I think that would kind of come back again to the attentional focus piece. And I know that I'm kind of touching on that a lot here, but um, when we think about kind of consideration for the work. I think one of the biggest things that we can do as safety professionals is encourage a culture of safety, which again, I know we talk about a lot, but it really is one of the best ways to get people to actually slow down and take attention and care in their work to reduce the risk of these injuries. If I'm chronically kind of running around or zooming around trying to get my job done because that's the productivity expectation, then slowing down to take that extra deep breath to connect with my body and core before I make a lift is not something that's going to feel like I have the time to do, despite that breath taking 5 seconds and that lift being much safer. And especially when you expose that repeated risk over time and time and time and time and time again, you're lifting that same weight over and over. That extra second, while yes, it adds an extra moment to the lift, you're more likely to lift probably more powerfully, more engaged. So the task is going to be easier and safer.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on walk pad use at a workstation?
Personally, I think they're great. No, from a dual task standpoint, actually, there's a lot that's come out on a submaximal movement. So things like a walking pad, like a cycling desk, even those little grip strength, the office fidgets. That's technically doing a dual task. So when we talk about these dual task costs, usually they're not so focused on those aerobic interventions or the kind of low efforts, generally subcortical movements. So walking, cycling, very easy kind of repetitive motion tasks. A lot of those tasks actually take place not with the thinking part of your brain. A lot of that's actually happening below your cortical spine. So you're looking at, subcortical structures in the brain all the way down the spinal cord with some muscular feedback loops occurring that never even quite make it, we don't think, up into your I'm going to call it again, your thinky brain. And so you're able to actually execute those tasks with minimal to no dual task costs, occasionally even dual task improvement on those repetitive movements. So from a performance standpoint, walking tasks are great. From a safety standpoint, if you've got one in your office, just make sure that you're staying aware of where you're at on the pad. If you can put up some barriers, some guardrails so that you don't accidentally fall off, because that is something that can happen if you're not paying attention. So, keep safety in mind from a couple different ways. But yeah, uh, from an attentional focus standpoint, a lot of times those low energy repetitive motion tasks are great for improving your attentional focus and memory.
Okay, so any way of quantifying the increase of the risk? So I get the possible assessment tool development.
Can you try and ask that maybe a bit differently?
Sure.
Thank you.
So assessment of, from my understanding, that my interpretation of the question, the assessment tools being some sort of tool to help assess a risk in the workplace of this dual task risk, I suppose it is.
Mm,
And
yeah,
Irene, if I have that wrong, please restate your question for us. Thank you.
so I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption here that we're talking about when we're considering uh, the quantifying the risk of a dual task cost. So, um, how what's the likelihood of injury due to dual tasking? I think that's something that you're likely to have to kind of do an assessment map within your own workplace. I think it's one of those moments where where I would really consider taking a look at the specific task and the potential for injury in that case. Again, for example, if I'm just going to lift a pen and my attentional focus is not on lifting that pen, the relative risk of me making an error in that task, regardless of how likely it is that I make that error, the risk of me making that error is very low. As soon as I start thinking about lifting something larger, heavier, more awkward that requires more motor planning, the risk of an error in those cases is going to be much higher. So that's where I would want to kind of consider how I'm assessing that risk. It's based on kind of the impact and the likelihood. And if I totally was off base with that, feel free to
Uh,
ask again.
no, I think you, Irene, said that was on point.
Okay,
Um,
great.
it sort of touches on a larger topic, perhaps, of in classic ergonomics. You go to a company, they may have athletic trainers on staff that sort of teach
Mhm.
proper lifting mechanics and so on and so forth. For neuroergonomics, you could look at it as, okay, we need to train our workers in this method, this task method, or we need to be mindful in our designing of workstations that don't impose a heavy cognitive load. So what's your
Yeah.
feeling? Where does the needle fall on that? What's the proper approach? How much do we of the onus do we put on the worker, and how much do we put on our designing of workspaces?
I think it's always easiest when you start with appropriate workplace design. It's much easier to have a workplace that has a low inherent risk to it. So if a specific task can have if we can design it better to have a lower risk, I think that's always incredible. But the great thing about a lot of this cognitive training is that you can do it really quickly, and we see some really sticky results from it. So in a lot of the athletic interventions, we're talking 15 to 30 minutes a week. So 5 to 10 minute sessions, 2 to 3 days a week, really relatively low effort. And to me, that's something that could be very easily integrated with a morning warm up or stretching routine, for example, in a construction site, where if you're already doing your physical preparation, your physical training for the day, toss in a couple of math problems, toss in some word problems, toss in some memory. It can be icebreaker style memory games, or you can start to get some ball tossing where you're maybe trying to catch red, right, green, left. You can throw hula hoops and throw and grab and catch based on whatever color your teammate calls out. So that gets you moving, gets your blood going, but it also forces you to look, see, think, and do all kind of in a really quick sequential order that can prime you for better success throughout your day and improve that attentional awareness. Plus, it's kind of a fun team bonding activity activity. So for spaces where you're already doing those interventions, I think it's very easy to add cognitive interventions that are relatively low load, but the impact can be quite great even from a low frequency. And those are really sticky too. Just as an extra note, some of the neurofeedback interventions that I've seen, they can last like 6 to 9 months from 12-week interventions. So you can see that lasts for a really long time. So it's a relatively low load that's very sticky when you induce this neuroplasticity. And so that's what I think. It's very easy to intervene in that way. And anytime that we can make the workplace safer by design, design it that way as best as possible. It makes the risk lower to the employee.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from an author of one of the papers that you cited during your talk.
Oh, no way.
Yeah,
How fun.
Ocean Tayagi asks, do you think dual task training will have a differential impact on whole body fatigue versus localized muscle fatigue?
Yeah, so that's actually what I'm hoping to study next as I move toward my postdoc. I really want to see kind of what's the interplay. So obviously we're seeing this uptraining, we're seeing all these positive benefits, but we don't actually have great links between how mentally fatiguing to how physically fatiguing are, because there's actually very few studies that look at both physical fatigue and mental fatigue at the same time. So there's ways that you can look at surface EMG or other what we would traditionally consider neuromuscular activations. So considering those versus neural activation or cortical activation through the EEG, there's not a ton of study on that. So that's something that I'm really interested in starting to look at and start to kind of tease out is how tight are these? How much is sensory versus how much is control?
Okay, great. Well, we have come up against the hour here. So thank you for the great, excellent questions, everybody. There were some other questions, very interesting questions that I did not get to. I apologize. So you can learn more and register for our upcoming events at coeh.berkeley.edu. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel where you'll find recordings of previous webinars and other events. And as a reminder, if you did log in with your registration email, you will receive a link to the evaluation form. And completing that form will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth one continuing education contact hour. If you have any questions in general for us here at COEH Northern California, you can drop us a line at coehce@berkeley.edu. That's coehce@berkeley.edu. MK has provided her email address on the splash screen there. You're welcome to, if your question is burning, please send it to her directly. And you may also request a PDF copy of today's presentation. With that, a big thank you, MK. That was a wonderful talk, a really nice change of pace from traditional ergonomics topics. So thank you so much. I don't know what happened to your audio, to your mic, but we lost you there.
Oh, I hit a button
Oh,
on
okay, we
accident.
got you. You're back. I'm sorry. What did you say?
I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for the time. I had a blast putting it together and really appreciate the attention. Great questions and engagement. So thank you.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.